Welcome back. In this unit, I'm going to show you a few other components, including jumbotrons and Bootstrap forms and inputs. But before I do that, I want to take a moment to address something that's really important when we're learning new tools like this, like Bootstrap. And in my experience of teaching people to become web developers, I've noticed that Bootstrap is one of the first places where some of the students start to feel uneasy, uncomfortable, and they feel like they don't know what they're doing. And that's because we're suddenly including a bunch of code someone else wrote into our application. And if you take a look at the docs here, they're really long, they're comprehensive, which is great, but there's a lot here. And I want you to frame this not as a manual that you have to read in order to understand everything. This is not like a how-to guide that you have to finish before we use Bootstrap. It's a reference where if you decide you need a form, you look at the form section. If you need a table, you look at the table section. If you need a navbar, you look at the navbar section. But it's important that you treat the docs like that. You will be using them nonstop, coming back to here, referencing individual bits of code, copying their code segments, checking out some demonstrations, reading examples. I've been using Bootstrap for years at this point, and I feel pretty good about most of it, but I leave the docs open when I'm working on anything with Bootstrap. I'm constantly referencing the examples. In one of the really early videos in this course, I talked about how to become a web developer, you're not becoming an expert in memorization and in knowing every bit of information. Yes, you need to know things. Yes, you have to understand and memorize some things, but you're not becoming an expert in memorization. You're becoming an expert in accessing information. And some of that information you'll have memorized, and a lot of it is going to be online, in documentation or examples, videos, books, all sorts of resources. All right, so to sum up that entire pep talk, basically, I just want you to keep in mind that, yes, there's a lot to Bootstrap, and you're going to see 20, 30% of it, and there's a lot more out there, but don't be intimidated by that. You should feel comfortable accessing the docs. If you need to do something that I don't show you how to do, open up the docs and look for it. And there's always great examples and explanations on getbootstrap.com. Okay, so without further ado, let's move on to talking about some of these important components, and I'm going to start by showing you Jumbotron. So a Jumbotron, according to the official docs, is a lightweight, flexible component that can optionally extend the entire viewport to showcase key content on your site. You can see an example of one right here. And if we want to use a Jumbotron, it's really easy. All we need to do is write div class Jumbotron, and then whatever we put inside of that will be part of the Jumbotron. So let's try that. Just do it below our buttons. We'll have a div with class Jumbotron, and then inside of there, let's do an H1. Under H1, we'll say this is a Jumbotron, and then let's add a button in there, just like they have here, and we'll add a paragraph as well. And our paragraph will just be gibberish, good enough for now, and a button. And our button will just say, hi there. Okay, and then a button, we have a few choices. We'll do a button success, and we'll make it large. And save. And let's take a look at what we get. And there's our Jumbotron. You can see that it takes up the entire width of our browser window. And that's not usually what we want. And what's happening is that the Jumbotron is set up to take up 100% of whatever container it's inside of. And in this case, it's not inside of anything. But shortly, I'll be showing you the grid system in Bootstrap, where we can control exactly how much we want this to take up of the screen. If we want it to be centered and take up a third of the screen, 2/3 of the screen, a quarter of the screen, we have all these different choices we can make by using Bootstrap's grid system. For now, I'm going to show you another element we can add in, which is a div with class equal to container. And what container will do, if we just put stuff inside of div class container, it gives it some spacing, some padding around it, and it centers things. So the container, if I inspect it, takes up all of this space here, so you can see, but it has quite a bit of margin on it. So if we just want a quick improvement without having to use the grid system, which we haven't talked about, we can add div class container. And now we get this nice looking Jumbotron. And if we move this code that we already have down into the container as well, but we won't put it inside the Jumbotron. You'll see that it still is affected by that container. So outside the Jumbotron, but inside the container, save and refresh. You can see it's also inside that container, and it reflects that visually. Okay, let's head back to components. And the next thing that I'll show you, if we go to the top, we have to go over to CSS, and I'll show you the forms and how those work. So click on forms, and there's quite a few different types and different examples, and I'll just scroll through them first before we type anything. So here's a basic example of a Bootstrap form. You can see the markup that creates it. Then we have what's known as an inline form. Then we have another type of inline form, and yet another one with different types of inputs. And then another type of form. And now this talks about all the different type of form controls, the different types of inputs that are supported. So all of these, color, URL, email, number, week, time, and so on. Text areas, different checkboxes, disabled checkboxes, disabled radio buttons, inline checkboxes, inline radio buttons, drop-down menus, selects. Keep going down. We have other form states. We have a focus state. You can see this highlighting around it, that blue. That's the default Bootstrap focus styling. We can also disable inputs by adding in disabled. And we've also got a few other things we can do, but I'm going to go back up and really focus on the basic example to start. And I'll start by just copying this entire form over, and then we'll dissect it bit by bit. So let's go back here, and we'll just add this form after everything else, but I will do it inside the container. So let me make this full screen for a moment. We have our form, and inside that form, we've got quite a bit of content. Let's go back to the browser and take a look at what it looks like. And the first thing you'll probably notice is that our form goes all the way across this container. It takes up 100% of that width. And that's something we'll be able to control once we talk about the Bootstrap grid system, and we'll easily be able to say, this should go 50% of the way across. So that's something we'll be able to easily change once we talk about the Bootstrap grid system. But we're not there just yet. So we're just going to go with it. It takes up 100% for now. It's a gigantic, weird looking form, but that's fine. We love it how it is. So we'll go back to Sublime, and let's dissect this one piece at a time. So we have a form tag, and inside of that form tag, there's a div class form group. And if you wanted to know more about what that does, you can go back to the Bootstrap docs and do a search for form group. And you can see wrap labels and controls in form group for optimum spacing. So if we get rid of that form group class around this first one, and we'll do it around the first and second one, you'll see what we end up with. I'll save and refresh. You see how the spacing changes here between those inputs. So we can go back and add that form group. And this is really how you use it, where you have an input and a label, and you want them to be grouped together. You use form group. So pay attention right here. Just a little bit of space is added right there. It just adds a little bit of space right here, which effectively groups these two together visually, and then groups these together visually, as well as these down here. So that's form group. And then the labels are just normal. We don't have to add anything fancy to the label, no Bootstrap class. But the input, there is a class, form control. So let's see what happens when I get rid of it. So I'll just do it on the first input, the email input, and go back and refresh. Notice that this completely changes back to a normal default browser input. So we don't get the rounded corners, we don't get the same padding and spacing of things, and we also don't get the same focus effect. When I click, we do get a blue outline, but it's different than this one. The Bootstrap outline is a little more subtle. And those are just the immediately obvious visual changes between the two. But there's actually some more important differences that you'll see once we get working with the grid system and the way that they behave and interact with other elements. But we'll go back and add form control again. So really, if we wanted to distill this, everything here boils down to form group and form control. Those two classes are really responsible for making things look good. Now there is this paragraph class help block, and we can take a look at what we get from that. It's this text down here which just gives a little hint, a pointer about part of your form. And that's done with the class help block. And then we have our button down here, which is just a regular Bootstrap button where we have BTN and BTN default. And we could make it larger or smaller, extra small, change the color, just like any other button. So already you can see how this is a little bit like Legos, where we have a button Lego that we can add into a Jumbotron. We can also just add it on its own, or we can add it inside of a form. It's just a little plug and play component that we can add into different parts of our application. So let's go back and take a look at one other type of form, which is the inline form. So this looks slightly different. If we just copy this code over and we take a look at what the difference is, so I'll leave that first form and let's add a comment down here, inline form. And let's indent things properly. Looks good. Notice that everything is identical. We still have form control on the inputs. We have form group, but there's one big difference. Everything's inside of a form with class form inline. So that one line, let's just show you what it looks like to start. If I go back, gives us this nice inline form here. And as soon as I get rid of that and save, it now goes back to a regular form like we have up here. So just one class contains all the styles that will control that. So we'll keep it as form inline. And again, the spacing is not ideal right now. That will be fixed when we talk about the grid system. There's plenty more we could talk about around Bootstrap forms. We could probably do 30, 45-minute lecture on just building complex forms with Bootstrap, learning the ins and outs of all of these different pieces and different things that we can do, validations, custom sizing, all sorts of different styles we can work with. But I'm not going to do that. We've covered the important basics. Those two types of forms are kind of the bread and butter of Bootstrap forms, where we have the basic regular form and then an inline form. And there will be a few other features and different aspects of Bootstrap that we do use around the forms. But rather than spend time right now and bog you down on all the ins and outs and the small details of Bootstrap forms, I'll just throw in those little pieces when we need them when we're actually using Bootstrap. So the two takeaways here about forms would be two classes that are really important: form control and form group. Form control makes the inputs bootstrapified. Form group just adds some nice spacing. So whatever you put inside a form group gets some nice spacing. And then single class form-inline. If you wrap a form in that, the entire form goes inline. And then we also talked about Jumbotrons. Very simple. Class equals Jumbotron, as you can see up here. And then we put everything inside of a container. And if we get rid of that container, just show you what happens. Refresh. All that spacing, all that nice margin goes away. So container is a nice way just to get a quick bit of spacing on your app, make things look relatively nice. Okay, so before I end this video, I'll spend 10 seconds showing you a site that we're going to build, an application that has a full backend database connected. We're using Node and Express and Mongo and Mongoose and a bunch of technologies. And we use Bootstrap to prototype the interface to make it look relatively good pretty quickly. And you can see we have a Jumbotron right here. We're using some of the buttons. We're using the grid system that I'll explain later. And then if I go to log in, you can see we have a form. So these are form controls that I've styled using the grid system so that it doesn't take up the entire width of the screen. Rather, it only takes up this little middle section. So we'll see that once we talk about the grid system. But I just want to show you that this is a real application, and it's something we'll use Bootstrap on to help us prototype and get things looking decent pretty quickly.